Episode 7: A Depot, Potatoes, Picnics, and Ice. In 1836, a tavern was built along what was then called the White Lake Road. This road had once been an important Native American trail. Before long, a little hotel replaced a small tavern, and then a grocery store was built, and a blacksmith shop, and a village was born. It was called Buckhorn. By 1871, the train had come through Rose Township and brought big changes to the township. For example, the commercial center of Rose moved down the road to where the railroad tracks crossed the road, and a new little town was born. The railroad was part of the Holly, Wayne, and Monroe Railroad Company. It started in Holly, went through Rose to Milford, and then to Wayne, and then to Monroe. By 1872, that little company had been purchased by the Flint and Pere Marquette Railroad, and now it was extended to Flint and Saginaw, and all the way across the state to Ludington. The train brought lots of changes to Rose Township, including the new little town. The land where the town was located had originally been owned by John A. Wendell. John Wendell had been the first supervisor of the township. He was also one of the first justices of the peace and one of the first poor masters. In addition, he was the first postmaster of Rose Township. He would serve in that capacity until his death in 1858. Newspaper articles reported the death of John Wendell. It was called a fatal accident. He had gone to Flint to pick up some lumber, and on his way back stopped at a small hotel to spend the night. Early that morning, on his way to go home, he came down the stairs and tripped and fell and broke his neck. Upon his death, his land was divided among his heirs. This parcel went to his granddaughter, Phoebe McCurdy. These two parcels to his son, Joseph Wendell. And this large area ended up being owned by his son, Andrew Wendell. According to this deed, in 1868, Andrew Wendell transferred that land into his wife's name. She was Martha Wendell. It's unclear why he did so, but it would stay in her name for a while. In 1871, Andrew and Martha platted a small town here in the northern part of the land. Platting meant that they had the land surveyed and a map drawn showing a new little town. They called it Wendell. It was recorded in the Oakland County land records as the village of Wendell, listing Martha Wendell as proprietor or owner of the land. There were several streets shown in what was to become this little town. There was Clinton and Mason and Gross and Water and Shiawassee and Franklin and Eaton and South. Of course, not all these roads were ever built. Some of them never came to fruition. Today, Clinton, Mason, and Water are there, and Franklin. And Milford now is the name of what had been Shiawassee. But as you can see, the other roads were never built. In 1871, the first house was built in the platted village. It was built by William G. Miller. He had come to Rose to help build the railroad. He would live the next 65 years of his life in Rose Township. He's shown here at age 95 when there was an article about him in the Detroit Free Press. Not much happened for a while after Mr. Miller built his house. There was a problem. There was no depot, so the trains just passed on through. Milford already had a depot by that time, and it was starting to grow and develop. So the people of Rose went to the Flint and Pere Marquette Railroad Company and said they wanted a depot. The company said, if you can raise $850, we'll build you a depot. It took a little while, but by 1877, they had raised the money. But there appears to have been a problem. According to a newspaper article, the citizens of Buckhorn are getting quite high-toned since they are to have a depot and think they must have a new name for their village. Some say Rose Center, while others want it to be called Wendellville. So apparently the people didn't want to stick with the name Buckhorn, but there was a disagreement over what they should call it. Despite the fact that the Wendell family had named it Wendell on their map, the name Rose Center won out. By 1878, the depot had been built. And that same year, a two-story general store was built. It brought in lots of new goods by train to Rose Township. The store was built by someone named Philemon Calkins, commonly called Phil. He'd been running a store in Holly, Michigan, a very successful one, and had decided to build a store in Rose Center. But according to records, he never really ran the store himself. The census showed that his stepson, Alonzo Cornell, was actually the storekeeper at the store. It turns out, however, that same year, 1878, another store was built right here along Shiawassee Road. Competition for the Phil Calkins store. That building is still here and used as a private residence. The little store was built by Warren Breed. Warren Breed had been living down the road on a little farm in this section, section 26. He'd been the postmaster of Rose since 1862, and he was running the post office out of his house along the road. In 1878, he decided to move into Rose Center and build his little store there, which also became the post office. In 1883, Phil Calkins decided to sell the store. And who did he sell it to? Warren Breed. Apparently, Warren Breed felt he wanted a bigger store than the one he had built. So Warren Breed sold his store to James R. Gardner. James Gardner had grown up in Tyrone Township, right here. Tyrone is in Livingston County, but it just happens to be right next door to Rose Township. In 1871, James Gardner had married Emma Kinsman, a girl who grew up on a farm right near him. That same year, his brother, Austin, married her sister, Mary Kinsman, and all four of them became members of the Kinsman Cornet Band. That band was started by the girl's father, Saul Kinsman. It was quite a famous band. It played all over Michigan and in other states like Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Ohio. Interestingly enough, it was one of the few brass bands in the United States at that time that had female musicians. By 1883, James and Emma had left the band and were running the store at Rose Center. According to the newspaper articles, they would run it till about 1898, because at that time, the news reported that the store was now vacant and they were actually holding dances in it. The Gardners had moved to Fowlerville, Michigan, where James was running a drugstore. The Calkins store had many more owners than the Breed store had. In 1890, Warren Breed sold the store to Charles Sutton. Sadly, he died just 1 year later. And the store then was purchased by Hobart Vroman. Vroman had been running a general store in Richmond, in Macomb County, Michigan. He sold it in 1893 to Henry Van Dusen. Henry Van Dusen was married to Annie Sutton, who just happened to be the sister of Charles Sutton, who had once owned a store. Just another example of how history is connected and twisted and turned. In 1895, Henry Van Dusen would sell the store to Charles Barnett, who would own and run it for many years. Charles was the son of two Jewish immigrants, Joseph and Rachel Barnett. They had come from Prussia to the United States around 1850. And they had moved all the way across the country to Sacramento, California. What had taken them so far? It seems to be it was the gold rush. But Joseph wasn't a miner. He was a merchant. He was a peddler, one of many Jewish peddlers who had gone to California hoping to make a living by selling goods to the gold miners there. There were some other famous peddlers. For example, Levi Strauss, who of course would become the inventor of blue jeans. In 1871, the Barnett family had moved to Detroit, Michigan, where Charles was born. In 1893, he married Ella Thorpe. And in 1895, they had moved to Rose Center, where he was running the store. According to a newspaper article, Charlie is postmaster, mayor, pound keeper, and pathmaster at Rose. If it were not for him, the map makers would never put the name Rose Center on their map. Clearly, Charles Barnett was an important person in Rose Center. In 1907, Charles Barnett was running a second store in Clyde, Michigan. Clyde is located in Highland Township, just down the railroad tracks from Rose Center. By 1909, he had sold the store in Rose to Elmer Lake. In 1910, Elmer Lake sold the store to Laverne Lake, who was likely a cousin, and William Shuttleworth. By 1914, Laverne Lake was the sole owner, and he would own it and run it until 1949, when he passed away. It would then be purchased by Bertha Halsapple and her daughter, Hazel. They would own it until 1952, when unfortunately the store was destroyed by fire. In 1881, a new building would be built in Rose Center. That year, Martha and Andrew Wendell sold this lot to the people of the township of Rose, and a town hall was built. Who built the town hall? None other than William G. Miller. The entire project, lot and building, cost $779.93, of which Mr. Miller earned $105. The town hall became the focal point, the center of Rose Center. Newspaper articles show the many ways in which it was used for funerals, for plays, for church services, dances, debates, ice cream socials, and meetings. Plenty of meetings. Fortunately, that building is still here. It's an officially designated Michigan Historic Site. In fact, it's the only Michigan Historic Site in all of Rose Township. Remember, there were lots of meetings held in the Township Hall, and one of the groups to meet was a local unit of the Ancient Order of Gleaners. The Gleaners was an organization of farm families designed for the purpose of life insurance, social activities, and community improvement. It still exists today, called now the Gleaner Life Insurance Society. Each local unit of the Gleaners was called an arbor, so there were many arbors across the state of Michigan. In 1899, Rose Arbor had been formed in Rose Township. This was one of the first units of Gleaners to be formed. And why was that true? Why was Rose Arbor formed so soon? It's likely that the Rose Arbor formed early because Grant Hiram Slocum, who founded the Gleaners, was actually born and raised in Rose Township, right here in Section 9 on his father William's farm. He had attended Jones School, which was actually located right on the family farm. And when he moved to Cairo, Michigan, and founded the Gleaners, he always said he kept in touch with the people of Rose. Women were a very important part of the Gleaners Association. Here are some women from Rose Arbor. In the center, the captain, who was Ella Barnett, the wife of the storekeeper, Charles Barnett. This group of women had a fundraising project. Their purpose, to raise enough money to build their own meeting hall. By 1907, they had raised enough money to purchase this lot in Rose Center. And by 1910, they had raised enough money to build a Gleaners Hall. That building is still here today, used now as a private residence. In 1883, there was a land transfer that affected Rose Center. In that year, Martha and Andrew Wendell sold their land, which included Rose Center and most of the land around it. They sold it to James McCurdy and Benjamin Shuttleworth. Now, James McCurdy had a Wendell connection. James McCurdy had married Phoebe Wendell, who of course was the granddaughter of John A. Wendell. Remember that Phoebe had inherited this parcel of land upon her grandfather's death. Then she and her husband James had purchased that piece of land from her uncle, Joseph Wendell. And now they owned that piece of land, essentially owning all the land in and around Rose Center. But what about houses? A town needs houses. Well, in 1884, McCurdy and Shuttleworth sold this lot to Charles Hicks, and he built a house on it. Now, Charles Hicks has a Wendell connection. Charles Hicks is another grandchild of John A. Wendell. That house is still here today at 144 Franklin. By 1908, several more houses had been built in Rose Center. Today, 7 of them are still here. The train had brought new goods into Rose Center, but it also brought people. And what were they coming for? For picnics. Rose Center had a perfect place for a picnic. It had a grove of trees, and it had this beautiful lake. And according to a newspaper article, Rose Center seems to be a natural center for a picnic ground, a pleasant retreat for a day of pleasure. Railroad picnic last Saturday. The Sunday school will use the grounds on Wednesday, and the Grand Army of the Republic on Thursday. There are 13 rowboats and one steamboat on the lake. People were coming to Rose for a picnic, and many of them were coming by train. The train brought goods and people into Rose Center, but it also took things out. Farmers were sending out everything from sheep to potatoes. And starting in 1896, a new good was being shipped out of Rose Center. Ice, great big blocks of ice. People needed them for their ice boxes. And Rose Center had the perfect combination for ice harvesting. It had a great big lake and a railroad track right next to it. And before long, ice houses were being built for storage right between the lake and the railroad track. Not long after that, a boarding house was built, big enough to hold 100 workers at night. And who built the boarding house? None other than William G. Miller. Refrigerators would kill the ice business, and ice harvesting would disappear. But picnics would remain, thanks in part to Dr. Daisy Northcross, a prominent African American physician from Detroit. Dr. Northcross purchased the land where the ice harvesting business had once been, and where the ice houses had been, she built a series of small cabins, and she developed a resort she called Medicine Acres. This was a time of discrimination and segregation in our country, when African Americans were not welcome at white resorts. So Dr. Northcross built a resort in Rose Township where African Americans could come and vacation. The resort offered horseback riding, speedboating, fishing, croquet, softball, golf, and of course, picnics. In the past, Rose was a wonderful place for a picnic. And that's still true today. 3 wonderful parks where you can have a picnic: Civic Park, Dearborn Park, and the 640 acres of Rose Oaks County Park. A lot had happened in Rose Township since that early tavern was built in 1836. Towns like Rose Corners and Buckhorn had come and gone. The railroad had come through, and Rose Center was born. But what happened next? Stay tuned. There's more history to come.